Retrocast.
What up, and welcome to Or Whatever Movies. I'm your co-host Iris, and I'm here with my older brother
Wesley. Hello.
Today we are discussing A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Golden Globes liked this movie perhaps a little bit more than the Academy. Nevertheless, after the Academy Awards, we're on what, our 12th?
12, 13?
We've done 12 or a dozen or so Or Whatever Movie episodes so far. How are you feeling we're doing, Wes?
I think we're doing pretty well. I don't always get out the things that I want to say in the course of our time, but generally I get my thoughts out, and yeah.
We've gotten a little bit of feedback. I've been told that our listeners want a little bit more context on us.
On us?
Yeah.
Who wants to talk about that?
I mean, why are we in any place to talk about movies?
Well, we're both producers, working producers.
Yeah.
Have been, in my case, for over a decade. In your case, a lot longer than that. I think we are in the business because we feel like we have potential to tell good stories, and we see lots of movies as a result because we like going to movies.
I love watching movies.
Yeah, so we were raised on movies. It's kind of the reason we started the family podcast where we talk about mom and dad and significant others and things, because we live and have lived our entire life with movies. Our parents love movies. We watched a bunch of them growing up, and now we have opinions.
I think pretty worthy ones too.
Yeah. As we said in an early episode, it is not our opinions that matter on the movie. You form your own. It's our ability to defend and talk about our opinions in order to justify them.
Yeah, and hopefully people feel like they're hanging out with their friends. So this past weekend, I was watching Ratatouille with my daughter, Paloma, your niece, which, by the way, you should come see her sometime.
Paloma Doma. Well, I would, but someone's going out of town this weekend.
Yeah, one weekend. Anyway, I was watching Ratatouille with Paloma, and I love the moment when Ego goes to Remy's restaurant and eats the ratatouille and is transported back to his childhood.
Yep.
And it basically it reintroduces him to his love of food, but it inspires him to write this really touching review. And in the review, he says something to the effect of, "What I do as a critic can at best only pale in comparison to the achievement of like the art itself." And it made me think about what we do here.
It just allows that his critique is not objective, right? He is so transported by the taste of a simple dish, and it breaks through the crusty exterior of old bitter narcissism or whatever he has. Yeah, that he has now. And that's kind of my focus too. We talk a lot of trash, I think, about movies, and just we're trying to get to the meat of the stuff we love. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the movies that I have qualms with, that I voice on this podcast, are more in disappointment because I really wanted this movie to work. I really wanted something to go so right, and when they screw it up so profoundly, it's kind of disheartening.
Sure. It's a bummer, for sure.
Yeah. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is no exception to that.
Tell me. Good segue.
Matthew Rhys said in an interview that he got the script for this movie and turned to his wife, Carrie Russell, and said, "Who's Mr. Rogers?"
No.
And she said, "Get out of the house," because he was born in Wales. Didn't know who he was. Mr. Rogers is an American institution, has been for decades, long preceding us. I wondered how mom and dad might react to this movie, given that they didn't grow up with Mr. Rogers. I mean, he started in the 60s for sure, but they were all already well into adulthood by then.
Sure.
If you don't have a basis for Mr. Rogers, this movie is just going to seem weird. I think the comparison to Michael Jackson is not all that far off. I think that he is someone that you idolize and revere in your childhood for what they can show you, and emotions that they can open up in you, but maybe not the best suited to represent people as adults. In the real world, Michael Jackson's kind of a weirdo, and you innately distrust Mr. Rogers in a cynical world where he tries to do good things and doesn't depart from his TV show persona.
Sure.
Kind of my problem with this movie. So, as Mr. Rogers, Tom Hanks, you would think, was an obvious choice. He played
Forrest Gump.
Yeah, well, obviously, and he played Walt Disney not long ago.
Mr. Banks.
Yes, in Saving Mr. Banks. He would seem to be the go-to person for the beloved persona of someone like Fred Rogers. Does he look anything like him? Does he sound like him? No. He's got a few mannerisms and he dresses like him.
Got the cadence down.
Got the cadence down for sure, but my first concern was whether or not Tom Hanks would be effective as Mr. Rogers. And in this movie, I have to say that he was, because I think that the reverence people have for Fred Rogers is akin to the reverence that many of us have for Tom Hanks.
He kind of squeaky clean.
Kind of squeaky clean, immediately likable, but when Tom Hanks looks at you, there's a reverence for him that's undeniable. He didn't have to play a spot-on Mr. Rogers, because my association and love for Mr. Rogers is buried under decades of adulthood. And so, but for Tom Hanks, he may have been the only person who could do it in a way that when he speaks, I would take him at face value, even if he's maybe doesn't fit in his surroundings, in a cynical world. So I think that, I figured you'd be take much more umbrage to this, but I think that Tom Hanks was well suited for the role of Mr. Rogers, maybe ideally suited, and Mr. Rogers' widow said the same, even if he doesn't look or sound a whole lot like him.
I thought he sounded and looked a lot like him.
There were moments where I was like, oh, there it is. But he went up against someone who didn't use any kind of camera tricks, single camera for a lot of that show, in full focus, center frame for the whole thing, except when he was Daniel Tiger and a lot of the puppet things. It's undeniable that if you watch archival footage on YouTube of Mr. Rogers, you'll see the differences immediately. He wasn't going for 100% spot-on performance, but there was enough there. And so I think a lot of our reverence was attributed to Tom Hanks as much as Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Won't You Be My Neighbor?
Yep.
And going into this, I didn't have any concerns about Tom Hanks. I thought he was pretty believable. But when they did show archival of Mr. Rogers at the end of the film, I was taken out a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I was reminded of how different they look. I thought that Tom Hanks brought too much simpleness to this role. Like he was borderline Forrest Gump.
There were many times where his cadence kind of slowed down and it was almost Southern, and it was like he was struggling against that Alabama accent. I will agree. I couldn't help it. There were some times that it was Forrest Gump. But again, all stuff I'm willing to overlook. I would venture to say that Marielle Heller, who directed this movie, all of that was sort of toned down, simplified, everything she brought to it, that it was almost... So here's my problem with this movie, that we can get right into it. The whole movie, especially the transitions, which were the most noteworthy, right? With the Mr. Rogers style, what's his land called? Happy Land Adventure Time or whatever?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
The neighborhood of toy cars and things. So every travel montage going across, everything was styled in the sort of Mr. Rogers neighborhood style. And very distracting.
Yes.
And annoying to me.
Yes.
As much as I love the show, we were in the real world.
Yes.
And there, I think, opposing the dichotomy between the real world being cold and hard and unforgiving, and then the sort of warm envelope of Mr. Rogers and his persona and his love and things should have stood in stark contrast, so that Lloyd would have been sort of rightfully dubious about, is this guy for real?
Sure.
Because he's so out of place, it seems, in the real world. When he's sitting in a diner and saying things, it shouldn't make sense. I get this, you're on the show, but in the real world. But Marielle Heller, it looked like she in deliberately was suggesting that the entire world was actually Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And that bothered me kind of a lot. It took me out every time it happened.
Yeah.
You know what it felt like? I was waiting. Okay, so we're going to get into the diner scene, which one person, I cannot remember who, said was one of the 60 most impactful seconds in movie history.
Really? The diner scene is one of many filmmaking devices that I think takes us out of the film. The people sensing something and stopping, the Lloyd Vogel photo in the picture book or whatever it was at the beginning, like there was no way for Mr. Rogers to have gotten that picture from Lloyd's sister's wedding to put it into his picture book. Like the whole kind of introduction to the film set the tone that this somehow wasn't real or was fantastical.
Right. Marielle Heller, the director, treated this movie as if it were part of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So in the diner scene, when he asked for a full minute of silence, and then Tom Hanks looks directly at camera and breaks the fourth wall. It annoyed me, and I was just waiting for him to say something like, "Do you like to play make-believe?" And just, it was like this whole movie was a very special episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood,
Yeah.
And it felt contrived in that way. The Lloyd Vogel story never felt real. It wasn't real, in fact. It was definitely based on the article for a different guy. This was a different character who never had a fistfight at his wedding. It was based on a real journalist, yes, and the article was "Can You Say Hero?" And but this was a fictionalized version of it, and it always felt like that to me.
Yep. This movie deals with a lot of really heavy, serious, emotional, intimate issues. And yet it itself, from a story perspective, doesn't really do more than scratch the surface of some of these people's lives. I feel like in every scene, they're talking about something really important, but not living it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. They straddle that line pretty thoroughly throughout the entire movie. Where it seemed like a setup to talk about, because Mr. Rogers was not one, as we saw from last year's documentary, was not one to shy away from the serious topics, but he presented them in a way that were palatable for younger viewers who wouldn't feel overwhelmed or scared by the concepts, because they are part of life and they need to be understood and processed as a natural part of life where you will not have the tools to navigate the world, right? It seemed like this movie stayed too cleanly on one side of serious themes that kept it all palatable when it didn't need to.
It didn't need to because it was an adult audience and they could have dug deeper.
Right, and would have responded better, I think, to more accurate storytelling without shying from some of the deeper themes. The worst we got was a punch thrown at the wedding, but all in all, I was initially concerned by the PG rating that this movie received, and that seemed to present itself as a problem almost immediately and never left, because it did feel like a very special episode where we touch on themes that we know that violence, Lloyd was injured, and we want to find out how that happened, and we see his face, and it just, like you said, scratched the surface, never got any deeper, and would have been better served had it done so.
Yeah, so this was inspired by true events. Was there not more about the journalist's life? I mean, the journalist wrote an article about basically himself. Like, was there not more to have gleaned from that article?
I haven't read the article, but I will say that he was an interviewer who was ostracized and not very well regarded by his peers at the time. It is true that Mr. Rogers was advised against doing the interview with this particular journalist, did so because he wanted to find the good in every person, as Mr. Rogers seems to have always wanted to do, but that he was facing some personal and professional trials, and Mr. Rogers sort of saw through that like he does in the movie, and all that is fine, but if we're going to manufacture, and this movie is certainly more about Lloyd Vogel than it is about Fred Rogers, because in fact Tom Hanks's Oscar nomination came through Best Supporting Actor in a movie that was not about Mr. Rogers as much as it was this journalist character. And if it had been more hard-hitting in that way, if we had tipped the balance just a little bit in favor of the real world and only gone into this wonderful world of Mr. Rogers, which I will concede was wonderful, would have been more effective.
Did we talk about Matthew Rhys's performance?
No, let's talk about Matthew Rhys's performance.
So I came into this liking Matthew Rhys from The Americans and was expecting a lot of him, and felt like he didn't have a lot of material to work with. You
felt that it was the material? Because I came into this knowing nothing about Matthew Rhys, and I came out caring nothing about Matthew Rhys. I'm sorry, Matthew Rhys' husband to Kerry Russell, you were woefully miscast, in this podcaster's humble opinion. He's from Wales, has a strong Welsh accent. I don't know if he does in The Americans, frankly don't care. But he had the same problem that Ewan McGregor has in an American accent. It's a little bit too formalized, and it seems like he's struggling to keep that accent in check the entire time, and we're focused on that rather than on his performance or his emotions coming through in his face or in his actions. He seemed kind of stunted, and I didn't like him at all. And he was a troubled person, and I don't know that it was supposed to be immediately likable, but you're supposed to get a jibe and root for the actor, for the character, and I did not at all in this movie.
Yeah. Interesting that you say he was miscast. I didn't believe him when he threw the punch. And he plays quite an action-oriented character in The Americans, which never quite set right with me. I mean, I don't see Kerry Russell as an action hero either, but they both do a lot of fighting and I don't know. I mean, they're spies.
She was like a Star Wars bounty hunter in The Rise of Skywalker, and she was in Mission Impossible 3. She was a special agent.
And was she convincing?
Well, she died.
But, like, did you believe her fight scenes?
Yeah, I believed her gun handling scene. She took a lot of training. Anyway,
I thought that Matthew Reeves was a little bit a victim of the material, a little surfacey. I felt like he didn't have a chance to really dig in.
Yeah, you consider the material. The same material was given to Matthew Reeves as was to Chris Cooper, who shines even though he didn't look great in this movie. I don't think he was portrayed particularly well. I think he did the best that he could with his material, and he did a good job. I think Tom Hanks did a magnificent job, partially because he was Tom Hanks. Very well cast, maybe the only casting, despite looking and sounding not a whole lot like Fred Rogers. Everybody else in this movie fell flat to me, both Matthew Reeves and his wife. Everybody on Fred Rogers' crew, except maybe for the lady who played Mrs. Rogers. I thought she was fine, but everything else felt like a false construct, like a half-assed, low-budget recreation filmed for a special episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The whole movie felt like that to me, except for the anchors. And I thought that Tom Hanks was great, and Chris Cooper was great in his limited role, and everyone else was struggling with the same material that the major stars got, but I think it all under the direction of this person who, regardless of being a lady or not, did not knock it out of the park. Sorry.
Whoa.
No?
Heavy.
Do you disagree?
No, I don't. And I think you said it well. I mean, it was a little aggressive. I would like to propose a ray of shining light.
Go.
I, as a viewer, felt aligned with Matthew Reese's character, even if I didn't perhaps empathize with him as much as perhaps the filmmakers wanted me to, in that I felt his frustration when he was in interviews with Mr. Rogers, especially the second time when Mr. Rogers invited him back to his house and is almost willfully deflecting his questions, pulling out puppets and crap and like almost toying with him in a way. And I, as a documentarian or as a filmmaker myself, would have been frustrated with him.
Apparently he was pretty hard to interview because he would want to talk and turn it more onto the interviewee than himself. Wanted pictures of his new friends, as he put it, but never wanted to be photographed himself. I understand what you're saying. And I would argue that the sort of resistance to Mr. Rogers trying to, worm his way inside to figure out what's going on in Lloyd's head could have as easily been portrayed when Lloyd is forced to confront his father or his feelings about his father to his wife. Seemingly idealistic life, high-profile reporter, baby, family, all that good stuff. Troubles with his father, that's not uncommon, I guess, not to discount that situation. But any other time that those sort of emotions were present and he was struggling with them, it always fell flat to me. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I attributed that to Matthew Reese and maybe to the material. But any time Tom Hanks was on screen as Fred Rogers, he was so magnetic, I think, that Matthew Reese's character was almost shielding his eyes from that glare. He could not process that there was something that good and that pure that he was in no way prepared to deal with. So it's strange to be able to take what you're saying and attribute that to Tom Hanks, but that seemed to be the case. In every scene that he was in, I felt more for Lloyd. And yes, Mr. Rogers seemed impenetrable, but he still got in there. Right? As unconventional as his methods and probably as frustrating as they were, he still found a way in. And I attributed that to Mr. Rogers as a person who I sincerely believe, for better or worse, was that person. Not to say that didn't present its own difficulties in life, and his wife said that he was definitely, and I quote, no saint, not perfect, and a lot of times frustrating. That might not be a direct quote, But, yeah.
Did any of this work for you?
Tom Hanks worked for me. Chris Cooper worked for me. The lady who played Mrs. Rogers. Yeah, the irony is that everything felt false until we were in Mr. Rogers' world.
Because, well, probably maybe that was the intention. I mean, all of those stylistic filmmaking devices, like we were talking about before, kind of rooted us in it. The transitions brought us back to the world. The setup established the world. It ends with the family photo. I mean, it's bookended with that picture book or whatever that poster board was called, which makes the whole thing feel like a fantasy.
Yeah. And how you perceive that and how that fantasy sits with you, I guess, depends on what you want to get out of the movie. So what do you think?
I mean, I think it's a very gentle film. I think it's a very safe film. I think that it proposes to deal with heavy issues, but it does it in a very light way, a la Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But it was just a little too safe. It was a little too squeaky clean. If you say that this film is Tom Hanks, then I think Tom Hanks' performance was a little oversimplified, and therefore the film was a little simple and boring.
Yeah, I think his good role was supporting, and the rest of the movie just wasn't enough. You're saying it made it a boring movie? I would agree, except I don't have that rating. On my scale, it would be a whatever movie, elevated by some good performances. Tom Hanks said he didn't want to play real characters anymore. And then Marielle Heller, who he knows personally, brought this role to him, and he thought, well, I'm going to give this one another shot. And I think that he is good at what he does in this kind of role, but it's wearing just a little bit thin. He's playing, he doesn't have to play real characters because we're always basing it, especially in this day and age. He's covered a lot of the classics. Now we're getting into people who are still alive. Mr. Rogers is not alive, but he might as well be for how much footage we have of him and how easily accessible he is. But he doesn't have to. I admire what he did, what he brought to the role, and I think that in many ways he carried this movie.
All right, a whatever rating from Wes, a boring rating from Iris. This is our chat about A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
Ready for trivia? One of the inaccuracies in that movie is apparently Mr. Rogers, in his own pool, swam totally naked.
No.
Yep.
That's kind of juicy.
Thanks for listening.
If you have anything you'd like to share with us, please give us a call, leave us a voicemail at 818-835-0473, or send us an email at orwhatevermovies@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.
Miles, are you ready to record our promo for Season 2 of the Wanna Bet podcast?
David, have you ever seen a grown man naked?
Miles, we're not here to quote lines from Airplane. We're here to tell people that Season 2 starts August 18th.
But I like Airplane.
I know you do, but Wanna Bet is a sports betting podcast. Each week we bet $1,000 on the NFL teams and games that we love.
Well, that sounds like fun.
It is fun. And last year you picked over 60% of your games correctly.
How'd you do?
We're not talking about that. We are telling people that they can find us every Friday. So no more movie quotes.
Roger.
Electricast.
Introducing the Deep Leadership Podcast. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former submarine officer who spent 22 years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Deep Leadership is real-world, actionable leadership advice from John and his expert guests. Become a leader worth following. Subscribe today.
Electricast.